But you don't go into a negotiation saying it. The reason people have been saying they want Crimea back is so that you go in with a maximalist position, and that's one of the things you can give up without feeling too much hurt when you are inevitably going to have to compromise. To go in saying that's just off the table anyway means that the Ukrainians are already having their hands tied by an administration that just seems to want a deal at any price.
US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has denied Donald Trump is betraying Ukraine over his push to end the war there. Speaking at a NATO summit in Brussels, he said the American president should be praised for trying to broker a peace deal.
As President Trump has said, stopping the killing. And so that will require both sides recognizing things they don't want to. That's why I think the world is fortunate to have President Trump. Only he at this moment could convene the powers that be to bring peace, and that's a welcome sign.
Manveen, it seems to me that the US is about to hang Ukraine out to dry and hang the rest of Europe out to dry with it. And it makes me feel sick and it makes me feel a little bit scared. How do you feel about it?
Oh, about the same. About the same. I mean, I'm baffled by this. You know, for a president who's, you know, such a big part of the myth of Donald Trump is about the art of the deal.
Yeah.
I'm not sure he's very good at doing it. You know, Pete Hegseth arrived at this conference. The first thing he said was that Ukraine couldn't expect to see its borders in a pre-2014 way. That's over.
That's just bang, surrender.
Yeah. I mean, like, to be honest, most of us would have accepted that. You know, we know they're not going to get Crimea back. You know, anybody who's watched the situation would accept that. But you don't go into a negotiation saying it. The reason people have been saying they want Crimea back is so that you go in with a maximalist position, and that's one of the things you can give up without feeling too much hurt when you are inevitably going to have to compromise. To go in saying that's just off the table anyway means that the Ukrainians are already having their hands tied by an administration that just seems to want a deal at any price. And, you know, this isn't the first time we've seen Donald Trump doing these deals. I mean, if you go back to the Afghan withdrawal was a disaster for the Biden administration. It was incredibly badly handled, but actually a lot of that began under Donald Trump's last administration. The deal he'd done with the Taliban, you know, I interviewed Ashraf Ghani at the time, the deal he'd done meant that unless Biden came in and committed more troops, because they had let out so many Taliban prisoners, unless they committed more troops to stabilising the country, they were going to have to pull out and let the Taliban take over. I mean, it was catastrophic. But that was done as a Donald Trump, I've done a deal. It doesn't matter how good a deal it is, I've done a deal. And that's what this feels like now. You know, he's picked up the phone to Putin at a time where actually the Russian economy is finally really starting to feel the pressure. You know, he should have a stronger hand. I don't think he's playing it.
Fraser, there was a quote floating around yesterday from an unnamed British defence figure who basically said the bastards are going to do this, you know, talking about what America was doing. Is there any other way for us in Britain, in Europe, to see what's going on here than a betrayal by an ally?
A betrayal is a strong word. I think this has been a long time coming. For some time now, it has been fairly obvious that we've, as a continent, have asked Americans to do our heavy lifting.
They partly told us to let them do the heavy lift. I mean, like, it's not Germany's fault they demilitarised, really. Well, I mean, it's its fault, obviously, but, you know, America was very keen for Germany not to militarise.
America was also keen for Germany to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence.
Eventually.
For all, but right now, everybody has pretty much refused to do this because America is spending 3.5. So when we want to do something big, if there's a war in Yugoslavia in Europe's doorstep, then let's the Americans come in and sort it via NATO. If there's we want something to go down, and we want to do regime change in Tripoli, then let's the Americans come along and sort that out for us as well, even though it's just over the road from Europe. If there's a land war in Europe, well, let's let America do all of the heavy lifting. And there has been, for some time now, an anomaly here. And this isn't just Donald Trump. This was an anomaly in the Joe Biden years. This was an anomaly way before that. So when Barack Obama was president, he, of course, started to look over the Pacific rather than the Atlantic. This is a guy who has got a very different worldview. And when you look at America's interests, it used to be the case that you talk about the post-war years. Okay, let's have the Marshall Plan. America will basically provide Europe's security. Europe's economy will grow, and then we'll buy lots of things from America. So you could argue that America had a self-interest in that economic self-interest in European security. As the decades go, that interest wanes. And yet, what do we have in Europe? We've got a whole bunch of countries with a military barely worthy of the name. At one point, the French were dropping concrete bombs on Tripoli because they ran out of real ones. We've got a German military where they were using broomsticks in lieu of guns and exercises just a few years ago. You've got a British military, which is heading for its smallest size in quite some time. And by the way, a military is bigger than most others. But still, we basically lost Basra when we were saying to the Americans, let us handle the south of Iraq, we'll sort it out. No, we didn't have anything like the troop numbers to keep Basra safe. The city succumbed to terrorism. It had to be reinvaded by the Iraqis. So I think this should be seen in the context of lots of European failure to step up to the plate in defence, hoping that Uncle Sam would bail us out. And we never wanted to accept the question, what happens when Uncle Sam doesn't? And if it wasn't Donald Trump, it would have been someone else. Now, right now, we've got the Munich Security Conference. There's lots of countries, especially in Europe, discussing what's next. This has got a big backdrop now. What's next for Europe when America says that this is a European land war and we're going to leave Europe to sort it out?
Manveen, America's done...
Can I just pile in on that? Sorry, just because I completely agree that we should be spending much more on defence than we are. We need to be growing our military at a time where the world has rarely been less stable. And there's a really good column in the paper today by Ed Lucas. If you look at there's some really interesting ideas about how you could come up with a defence bank for Europe, which would basically mean that borrowing in order to pay for defence wouldn't cost very much. It's a really smart idea. It's being floated. The polls are all over it. We should be spending more. The whole of Europe should. However, I sort of think we've also slightly accepted this sort of Trump-American sort of interpretation of all of this, where, they keep telling us they keep turning up to fight our wars, which just isn't necessarily true. The reason so many of our militaries are...
Which of our wars did we fight without them recently?
Well, we haven't fought any world wars
don't
recently.
get me started on
Afghanistan, Iraq,
but don't get me started on the Falklands. But actually, both Afghanistan and Iraq weren't our wars.
They were their wars.
The reason our militaries are massively
Blair
degraded is because we've been
absolutely gung-ho for
because
Iraq.
we've
He
been
was
fighting
begging
their
the
wars.
Americans to do it.
Well, you say that, but it was a George W. Bush idea, and he went along with it.
He was the main cheerleader.
He was a cheerleader, but it wasn't our war. That was a George W. Bush idea. The only country that has actually used Article 5 in NATO actually has been America, and we have piled in behind them and fought wars that weren't particularly sensible. Libya, actually, they sat out. The Falklands, where were they? We let them tell us that they fight our wars, and we accept it, but we probably shouldn't. In the meantime, not only have they had the use of our militaries, they've used every country in NATO for their bases, which is hugely beneficial to them. We're about to fork out $18 billion for the Chagos Islands entirely to rent them for an American military base. Why are we paying for that rather than America? I don't think we say enough about how much we do contribute in this relationship. And the reason all of this was set up, after the Second World War was because America understood it couldn't win a world war without allies. And I sort of think that there is a moment where it feels like a lot of American society is forgetting that. And we should probably just sort of bang the drum a bit more about why allies matter.
But look, I think this is terrible what's happened today. I think it's appalling. I feel as sick as you do, Hugo. My point is that I don't think we can really claim to be surprised.
Well, so we've got to leave this in just a moment and take a break. Before we do either of you think there's a chance that this is, as ever with Trump, actually he's quite keen on there being a heavy US military presence in Europe? This is about the deal. This is about tariffs. This is about getting the EU to play nicer on an economic level with America. And if we do that, everything continues as normal. Everyone can be happy. Either of you think there's a chance of that?
I thought that, but I think going into trying to come up with that deal while you're basically selling Ukraine is not the best start. I don't think Europe's going to pile in and feel happy about it. I think they're much more likely to start looking at how they can up their defence, which is great, but also work out how they could fight without America if they needed to.
Fraser?
You look at the Russian stock market today, absolutely soaring. They don't think this is a tough negotiation. They think it's game, set and match. Yeah. Here, I'm prepared to take Trump at his word. He's been and J.D. Vance, they've been saying this for a long, long time. What they've done today is entirely consistent with what they said they would do. Maybe sometimes you have to believe them.
And the reason why I think it is actually a bit of a betrayal is because behind the scenes, in the run-up to the American election, they were telling all the Ukrainian people in Washington that they were behind them. Yeah. They were sort of saying that we will do a deal, but Putin won't accept it, and then we can commit troops, we can come in and we can fight your fights for you. They made an awful lot of promises, which they weren't saying out loud. While they were making the speeches saying we shouldn't be backing Ukraine, they were saying the opposite to anyone who represented Ukraine in Washington.